Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good wherever you are. I'm your host, That Lit Astro Chick, the channel where we discuss the natal charts of writers, artists, and anyone else that I find interesting. So I wanted to get back into doing a traditional natal chart reading just to get my feet wet in the game a little bit, because as I had explained in my previous video, I am a little bit of a fish out of water when it comes to that, because I haven't had a chance to really dive into these for the past couple months. Somebody that I really wanted to look at their natal chart was the Canadian author Alice Munro. Now, I do understand that she passed away this past spring at the ripe old age of 92. And I really wanted to look at her work because she's somebody who was a really big influence on me and the types of things that I really do like to write about. I know that, for example, on BookTube, that there are a lot of books that tend to focus on what would be considered to be like high concepts, so like speculative fiction, romance, thrillers, genre fiction, which I do believe has a very specific place. As somebody who got their bachelor's and their master's in creative writing, I've always been someone who has leaned more towards the literary fiction route. I do see that as, once again, just being another genre, just like the other ones are considered to be genres in and of themselves. And Alice Munro was really a powerhouse in that genre, because she writes a lot about what some places might call low concept writing. So low concept, it can sometimes also be described as a human interest story. So these are stories that take place in rather realistic settings that tend to dive more into the complexities of the human condition. She writes a lot about women who have to leave their homes, who go away from their homes, as well as to write about affairs or having very messy situations where people really do try to make it work, or they might lash out in some way, and then there are bursts of anger. But generally speaking, I find her stories to be kind of quiet. They're stories that really do settle down in your bones. Shortly after she passed away, her daughter came out and unfortunately, she had the experience where Alice's husband was assaulting her, if you know what I mean, because I know that YouTube can be kind of sensitive about those words. And Alice chose to side with her husband and stay. And it was very reminiscent of the types of stories that she writes. So I wanted to have a chance to take a look at her natal chart to see what was going on in her life, as well as to see if there's anything that I could learn about in terms of astrology and connect it onto her literary fiction. She does seem to be someone who is a complicated character, to say the least. And she's also somebody who, according to legend, got a lot of her stories from eavesdropping. So very similar to the American author Lucia Berlin, she had a lot of different types of odd jobs. And when I was traveling in my 20s, I met somebody who actually met Alice when she was on a shift at a diner. He knew it was her, and he had asked her, "Oh, is it you?" And then she said, "Yes, it's me." And she wrote her autograph on a napkin, and he gave her a very nice tip. Allegedly. Don't know if this is true. I just know that somebody had told me about this. So without further ado, let's go ahead and let's get into Alice Munro's natal chart. Now, Alice Ann Munro, which is her full name, what I can tell from the astrology that I found on her, she was born on July 10th, 1931. And she is labeled as an Aquarius rising, so I changed the times to go with an Aquarius rising. So I have this in my calendar at about 9:30 p.m. She would have been an Aquarius rising. And in addition to that, she is a Cancer sun and a Taurus moon. So the first thing that stands out to me about her chart is the fact that she has a conjunction with her sun and her Pluto in Cancer. Now, people who tend to be part of the Pluto Cancer generation, we would probably refer to them as being more often the silent generation with that particular birth time now. Pluto in Cancer was a time when there were a lot of developments in terms of family structure, reproduction, the first starts where people were more considered were considerate about race and consciousness and where we come from, because Cancer deals with all of those fourth house methods. This was also going to be a time when people may have been more concerned about their families, because 1931 is also the time of the Great Depression. And with her having that Sun-Pluto conjunction, I already see a problem there. Typically speaking, when people have a Sun and Pluto conjunction, they tend to be very controlling. But this also could be a really good aspect in terms of developing some type of fame when it comes to your life. Only because Pluto deals with things that we don't earn. And the Sun, it deals with our ego. It deals with in our lives, how they might come across to us. And seeing that Alice is someone who has her Sun in Cancer, she was most likely very much concerned with issues of the home, especially because she also has her moon at the 22nd degree of Taurus. The 22nd degree in astrology is referred to as the control or be controlled degree. So these people can be in a lot of situations. Alice in particular could have been involved in a lot of situations to where she was forced to either choose what she wanted for her life or to choose what her family wanted in her life and in their lives. And I do think that this is indicative of a lot of the stories that she wrote, because a lot of her stories were about young women who were forced to leave their homes and choose themselves as opposed to choosing what their family wanted. Another interesting fact is that she has her Chiron, and that is directly conjunct to her moon in Taurus. So this would lead to having a very unusual life, specifically when it comes to the home life, when it comes to the upbringing, as well as I would say when it comes to women, because the moon in a chart, anybody's chart, it can deal with women, it can deal with your home life, it can also deal with your beginning and end of life conditions. So as someone who probably has a moon in Chiron and Taurus, there was most likely something very unusual going on in terms of her family upbringing. She could have felt like she had a lot of control that was put on to her, and she had to figure out if she wanted to strike out on her own or to rely on what her family wanted. This also could point to perhaps having an existence that could feel superficial, or one to where she was oftentimes very much concerned about what her material goods were going to be. And I would say that that is even further exacerbated because her Saturn, which is at the 20th degree of Capricorn retrograde, is running in opposition to her Pluto in Cancer. And typically speaking, people who have this in their chart, they tend to deal with a lot of very harsh upbringings, especially in the earlier parts of their lives. So these are people that could have dealt with poverty, that could have dealt with extremism, whether it's religious or political extremism, racism, violence, bullying, a very strict parent, a lack of social support, and eventually that this was going to lead to some type of estrangement in the home because she does have this opposition. Another interesting part is that, as I said before, because her Sun and her Pluto are conjunct, her Sun is also running in opposition to her Saturn. And this can also point to having a life that is constantly going to be about the climb. This was a search of struggle and hardship. And because Saturn in Capricorn, because it deals with delays, this can also deal with having a late bloom when it comes to her career life. Because as I said before, she worked a lot of odd jobs. And from what I understand from the friend that I had in my 20s, she still continued to work odd jobs throughout her life. So even though she was this very much acclaimed and esteemed author in the later years of her life, she had been publishing throughout all of her life, but she still, in fact, worked as a waitress. And at first I thought that that was kind of cool, that she didn't see herself as being above anybody else, because writers can have really big egos. But I also would say that this could be indicative of just having a very strong, struggle, especially when it comes to her finances. However, I would say that because she does have her moon and that trines with her Saturn in Capricorn, that she could have experienced a come up of sorts through her marriages. And those marriages perhaps could have provided her with more stability than maybe what she could have had for herself. I do also see that she was able to adjust more to the person that she was at later on in time because her Mars, which is in Virgo, that trines with her Saturn in Capricorn. So that would be really good for having some very harsh conditions at the beginning of her life, and then maybe over time she was able to achieve more of that, but it was always going to be a consistent struggle, especially when it comes to that Sun-Saturn opposition. Another interesting thing that I find about her chart is her Uranus. Now, very similar to Toni Morrison, I believe, if I go back and I look, Toni Morrison and Alice Munro are both Aquarius North nodes. And her North node, if I remember this correctly, if I look down in here, Alice's North node is in her second house. So what that means is that in this lifetime, because she recently transitioned, in this particular lifetime, Alice was supposed to understand her value as well as her standards. And because her Uranus is conjunct to the North node, that could have meant that when it came to her lifetimes is that this was going to be the first lifetime to where she was going to be able to do this, because she also has her Uranus in Aries. And her Uranus also squares her Saturn as well as her Sun. So this could mean that she once again would have experienced multiple hardships. So one hardship consistently after another. But also because in a woman's chart, the Sun represents the men in her life. So while her marriages, she could have received a come up as far as more financial stability than what she had in her younger years, this also tells me that the man that she was married to, there is going to be a situation that would be kind of unusual, especially when it comes to the ways in which he expresses his sexuality. Especially because Uranus can deal with that. Because Uranus, it can deal with deviancies, it can deal with perversions. So I definitely believe her daughter, when she spoke out after she had passed and said that my husband did this to me and my mother stuck to him, I definitely could see that going on with that. And then also because Alice has her Uranus conjunct to her North node in the second house of Pisces. That's just the degrees where it starts. When it comes to Uranus in the second house, it doesn't typically speaking tend to like that house because it's going to refer to drastic losses, specifically when it comes to her income. So that I thought was rather interesting. Another interesting part is the fact that she has a stellium essentially in her sixth house. So we already spoke about her Sun and her Pluto that are conjunct in Cancer, as well as her Mercury. That's also in that sixth house. So her Mercury and her Venus, those are in the sixth. Are they in the sixth house? Yes, they are in. I need to get better at this. Okay, so her Venus is in her fifth house. And her Mercury and her Jupiter are also in her sixth house. I think that this could also have something to do with why, when it comes to the stories that she wrote, she oftentimes wrote about everyday routines, embracing a routine, or what the daily part of life is like. I remember one story where she had written about a couple that had gotten divorced, and then the husband moved another continent, and then the ex-wife moved and then started sending him harassing letters from there. Things that would just be kind of unusual when it comes to your daily living. And I can see how that would be something that she would be really focused on, especially because with having Jupiter in the sixth house, it works a little bit more at a detriment, because this would refer to being constantly worked, being overly worked, having too much work. And I think that also descendants were really important to her as well. And I say that because she has her descendant in Leo. So this would mean that in this lifetime, she would have been able to experience true love or someone who did love her. I wouldn't be surprised perhaps if if she really did feel like her spouse was, her one true love, and that could be one explanation for why she decided to stay with him. Unfortunately, after what happened with her daughter. I'm not excusing her, but I do want to also say that I really do believe that like those times were different, and perhaps she could have felt more focused on keeping the marriage together for financial stability as well as for emotional stability. And because she does have a lot of hardships that were occurring in her chart, like I said, she has a lot that would be working against her as far as obtaining what she needed financially. And I say that because she also has her Chiron in opposition to the midheaven. So her midheaven is in Scorpio. That would have meant that over time, she would have been someone who would have gone into more obscurity, which she did because she stopped writing 10 years before she passed away. But also to have that Chiron there, to me, it speaks to someone who could have a very checkered past, especially when it comes to getting their career started, because it's going to be on one of the lower points of the time of birth. The other one is that she has her Jupiter in opposition to Saturn. So this would mean that she would be more susceptible to having more mood disorders. She, unfortunately, would not have been someone who would have been able to stabilize her mood on her own. It probably would not have, it would have been a challenge for her. However, she does have her Jupiter running sextile to her Chiron as well as her moon. So because her Jupiter is in Cancer, it's not conjunct, but but I would say it's running parallel. This would mean that probably over time she could have been able to embrace more of those things that she ran away from in her earlier life. And I think that she embraced those in her writing. And that was why she's considered to be so critically acclaimed and such a fantastic writer. And I think that the last point that I want to talk about before I get to the North Node is, this one's interesting. So I'll talk about two more. So her Mercury trines her midheaven. I too have this in my chart. And the reason why this is really good is because it's going to refer to someone who will, over time, be able to use the way that they think and also the way that they write. Because Mercury, it deals with the 3rd and the 6th house. And those are the houses of communication. This means that over time, her communication would have been really important to her as well as to her writing. This also could speak to having a lot of fans because of that Mercury trining her. And because she has a Mercury-Jupiter conjunction, this would mean that a lot of people would really resonate with the stories that she writes. So that actually makes me really happy. The last point that I want to talk about is that I too have this, is that her moon trines her Mars. So typically speaking, people who have moon trine Mars, their homes are really important to them. They tend to have a really good public image because the moon can speak to the public and Mars speaks to your true identity. It speaks to who you really are deep down. And this also would have meant that when it came to the people that were in her life romantically, is that these were people who she could have felt very bonded to, very attached to, but it was most likely going to be a somewhat difficult relationship because she does have her Mars descending, so it does travel into that descendant house. So what I see from her chart is that she had a life that was very up and down, that was very unusual, that was filled with a lot of hardship, as well as an opportunity to really become herself and to come into her own. And what I've always found to be so fascinating about her stories is the way that these young women will oftentimes depart from what is familiar to them. As painful as it is, they will depart from what is familiar to them. And instead of sharing with others, they realize then that they have to take a responsibility. They have to take an opportunity as opposed to waiting for an opportunity to be given to them. But overall, I would say that she has a really interesting chart. I really hadn't thought about it before, but now it does make sense, especially when I look at the stories that she wrote and how a lot of them, they had to do with hardship and embracing your sexuality, as well as questioning your ethics. So those are all things that I think are really great. I'm really happy that I had the opportunity to read her stories. I'm really sorry about what happened with her daughter. I mean, I wish that is something that had not happened because, it shouldn't happen to anybody. But I think that that's where I want to wrap up here because I didn't want to blah, blah, blah endlessly. But I wanted to have an opportunity to just discuss a natal chart again. I think that the next video I have might focus more on a transit because I'm going through an interesting transit. But I'll save it for then. This now concludes my natal chart reading of the esteemed Canadian author Alice Munro. Please feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you want to leave a comment, please tell me what is your favorite story of Alice Munro's. Thank you.